Hey everyone, and welcome back to Todos Santos. Today we're going to build a vast agricultural area on the outskirts of town, and as we do that, we're also going to delve into the history of this region. Let's go! We're going to start filling in this area by defining some of the road networks that run through it. So I wanted these two roads here, the one that runs here, and then this one that we're drawing now, meeting up at this location here where we're going to have the town of Rio de Plata, which is also the name of the river. And I'm imagining they called it that because there was silver discovered in this region, and there used to be a big mining presence here. So at one point it was a mining town, maybe with a little bit of agriculture sprinkled in. But now as the mines have run dry and they've been abandoned, it's primarily going to be used as an agricultural area with lots of farms. We also have some highways running off into the mountains. These aren't really going to go anywhere in particular. I'm just imagining these would lead to other towns that are out deeper into the mountains. Generally, I'm trying to go down the center of the larger valleys, or when I had to, running along the side of the steeper slopes, or occasionally doing switchbacks here when you need to get to a higher elevation in a little bit less space. I'm not actually going to make outside connections with any of these roads because I just know that the game is going to pump out a whole bunch of through traffic coming down these tiny mountain roads, which isn't very realistic. So I'd rather just have them be there for aesthetics rather than functionality. Now we have this two-lane highway that's running left to right. That's parallel to the freeway. I'm imagining that this is the older highway that ran through here when it was just a small agricultural area before Todos Santos grew to the size that it currently is, where it's encroaching on this area. And then, of course, the freeway has been run through here more recently as the city's grown. So, of course, we need some sort of interesting connection here to attach the two highways to one another. I decided to go just for a very basic Trumpet interchange, looking at this one. In the San Juan area. Actually, it's closer to the town of Dorado, which is what I mostly used for inspiration for this build. I'm just trying to make it as clean as possible. We're not going to get to detailing it this time, because that area is going to be taken care of next episode. I will say, this is my first voiceover after the release of City Skylines 2, and after playing it a little bit, I think the road tools make certain things a lot easier, but you do miss out a little bit on getting the details just to your liking, but that's something we can get more into next time. For now, we're going to move on to getting rid of this rail line. I think I mentioned this last episode, but it didn't really go exactly where I wanted it to in terms of the lore of Todos Santos. So I'm imagining that this railway and this right-of-way has pretty much been here since the beginning of the town. It originally would have been a railroad town, where this would have carried in some of the exports from the mine and any agriculture that was out here, and taking that into the greater area of Todos Santos, where its industry would be able to take care of it. But we're not going to totally get rid of the original rail line that I had laid down here. We're going to get rid of the station and just pretend that it's an old, abandoned rail line. Maybe this served a similar function and there used to be a small town here, but that's since been abandoned, and all the urbanization of this area has been centralized in the town of Rio de Plata, which we're going to build later on. But first, I also wanted to reroute this river just to add a little bit more realism to this area, because it was kind of basically a straight shot from the ocean to the lake near the town of Gatonia, and I wanted it to kind of have these nice meanders that you get in real-life rivers for the most part. I wanted this river and the area as a whole to look fairly lush, imagining, of course, that they would have been drawn to this area originally for its capacity to fertilize the land and provide enough water to grow lots of food. So I decided to go in with IMT and use some of these very lush grass assets running along here, tilting it a little bit so that it's not just a flat piece of grass, it kind of lines up with the slope of the riverbank, and then also using the random angle setting so that it's not just the same grass tiled over and over again. It has a little bit of randomization to it, which makes it look a little bit more natural. And then I also discovered this function where you can paste IMT segments in between intersections, which allows for copying and pasting this thing very easily across the whole river. Okay, now that we've gotten a road network laid down, we're going to get to building the actual farm fields. I'm using a variety of assets for these, beginning with these field props, which come in a variety of sizes, so you can kind of make different shapes of these plots of land. And then where they meet up against the river, I'm just, instead of trying to make these props conform with the terrain that I have and these weird angles and everything, I just take some grass props and fill in any empty space with those to make it look a little bit more like there's a straight line at the edge of the fields. I'm also using these farm field networks, which I think are just probably the best tool for the job here, because you can use Node Controller to go in, select the end segment, and angle them as such, which allows you to fit them into these kind of more weirdly shaped triangular areas. And they also allow you to make them a little bit bigger or smaller, so you can fit these into whatever size area you have available. Although sometimes you do get these strange glitches when you're doing stuff like that, but for the most part, it works pretty much seamlessly. It took me quite a while to get used to all these different options underneath the advanced settings on the original Node controller, but basically I just ended up messing around with all the settings until I got a feeling for what each of them did, and eventually it just became second nature. I'm not sure what the equivalent is, or if you can even do this in the renewal version of Node controller, which I think is more widely used, so you might want to look into that if you're looking to make a big farm project like this. Now at this point, I thought the fields looked a little too plain, even though I did try to vary the texture a little bit with these different assets. So I come in and make some of these, I guess you would call them hedgerows or windbreaks. I didn't want to have continuous lines of trees and hedges like you sometimes see. I just wanted to go for this kind of clustered look that I noticed a little bit in the area I was taking inspiration from. And then of course there are also these little paths in between. I thought it looked kind of ugly to just have the plain grass texture sticking out in these little lines in between each farm field asset. So I just go in with the dirt texture with Surface Painter and paint that down to look like either some sort of access for farm equipment or irrigation equipment. Maybe they take their sprinklers or whatever they use and run them along these paths here to water the adjacent fields. I added another set of fields between the original ones and the main highway here on the left, and then I just went through and did the same sort of detailing over here. I think I probably could have mixed up the texture of the fields a little bit more. It kind of looks like there's too sharp of a distinction between the areas with a different texture of fields, but that's something I'm going to start improving as we go through the rest of the build. Now that I'd gotten a sense of how I wanted this build to go, I made this little ugly farmhouse that just didn't really look very good, so I cut it out. Don't worry, we're going to build a lot more of these as we go through this episode, but I did want to set the stage to have this place be a functional agricultural district. So I have these Industries DLC blocks and also some invisible farm fields. I'm just placing them down fairly sparingly because they generate a whole lot of traffic. Not an unreasonable amount, but quite a bit. So I didn't want this place to be swarmed with trucks, because if you've ever driven through farmland like this, you'll definitely see trucks here and there, but they're not exactly swarming the roads constantly. Or at least that's been my experience. I also decided to paint down the fertile ground texture just to actually give these invisible farm fields something to work with. Obviously, we're covering up all the textures manually with these farm field networks and props. Over on this side of the road, I tried to experiment a little bit by making like kind of a more mega farm monoculture sort of thing. I think it stands out a little bit too much though, so we're not going to do any more of that. We're going to go with the smaller plots of land with the varied farm textures. Of course, we need to just fill in all these annoying gaps in between the road and the fields with some more overgrown grass and some more trees that I guess would stand in for windbreaks or hedgerows again. For some of these tighter bends in the river, I thought maybe the land in between would be way too marshy to develop into agriculture, or maybe they could develop it into farmland if they had the money or the time or the budget or whatever, but it's just too expensive to do so. So I'm just filling that in with our typical low poly forest and some of these rainforest canopy assets as well. It might look a little strange right now, but eventually we're going to have some trees running along the whole edge of the river, which really helps it stand out compared to all the flat farmland, and you can see the course of the river just based on where the trees are. It's going to look pretty cool. Well, hopefully at least. So now that we have our little farmhouse that runs this whole area of farms, I suppose, we're going to create our first chunk of farmland that has some sort of unique identity compared to just generic farm assets. So these are technically banana trees, but I'm pretending that they're, of course, plantains, because I believe those are much more commonly grown in the Caribbean. I could be wrong on that, though. And also, plantains are delicious. If you've never had mofongo, you should go find your nearest Caribbean restaurant immediately and get some of that, because it's amazing. And then we have these blank spots in between the fields and the river. I'm just going to fill that in with a few trees, so we can really start getting that look that I was talking about before, with the trees running alongside the river. So we've gotten the macro stuff taken care of, and now we're going to go in and do the micro stuff, the detailing. So I don't really know that much about the day-to-day operations of farms or like what kind of equipment they have on hand. I mean, I know the basics, but I really just kind of had to make stuff up as I went. So we have some of these sheds, various piles of equipment I thought that you might need, some trucks and tractors. And I also tried to vary the terrain texture a little bit with some grass and decals just to make it look more organic. One of the details that I found was most important making these farms is like the roadside entrances, all the fencing that leads up to it, and then the gate itself, and all the details surrounding it. Because that's really, as someone who's been on like one farm in my life, really my only experience with this is driving past them and seeing these gates. So I wanted to put a little bit more detail into these than was already there with these nice pipe gate sets. I didn't really have anything else that fit, so I had to use those, and then some various other assets that I thought might fit, and some nice looking trees along the edge there. One thing I noticed going around Street View in this area in Dorado is that sometimes you'll see these bare trees that have, or like mostly bare trees that have a few red leaves on them. I don't know exactly what sort of trees those are or why they look so bare when everything else is very green, but I put in a few of these bare trees that I happen to have that had these red leaves on it. They're not quite the right type of tree. They don't have quite the same shape of branches, but I think they look good enough for our purposes here. Now, speaking of details along the highway, one of the most prominent things, of course, are power lines. They're kind of so ubiquitous that you almost forget that they're there, but they really do pretty much run down every rural road like this. We don't really need them to carry the power because I have a mod that removes the need for power lines, but just for aesthetic purposes, we're going to take care of them anyway. I thought it might be cool to use this abandoned railroad as sort of a guide for how to do things on this other side of the river. So in certain places, they've ripped up the rail and used the right-of-way to have a small stretch of road. And then the rest of it is going to continue on its original course along the river, and we're going to make use of that in our detailing. But more on that in just a minute. First, we need to build some generic filler farms. So here I'm using these Custom Industries DLC fields to have some sunflowers being grown here. Unfortunately, these assets, even though they look really good, or I guess the reason they look very good is that they're basically hundreds of individual sunflower props. So it actually ends up killing performance, even the LODs when they load in. Just looking at this field in particular, just absolutely kills performance. So unfortunately, I had to delete these fields and replace them with a more generic field prop, but I think from above, it ends up pretty much looking the same. But I did want to show you this because I just thought it looked fairly nice before I had to change it. Adjacent to this field, we have an area of the track that has just been left to be overgrown. So I'm doing this much like when I originally laid down the track. We have a couple layers. We have really short grass growing up on top of the track. Along it, there's slightly taller grass, and then, of course, a layer of trees alongside that. I wasn't quite happy with how that looked because we have, of course, the ruining texture that appears on the edge of the train track. So I just wanted to go in with Surface Painter and make it look a little bit more random so that it looks like there are various patches of dirt around it. Just kind of fits in a little bit better. Now on the other end of the old railroad right-of-way, we have an area where they're currently in the process of converting it into a road. So we have a little construction site here. This is probably one of those projects that they started and they were all excited about. and it kind of ended up going nowhere and just getting paused indefinitely. But I thought it was kind of cool, and it was another way to just add a little bit of variation and detail to this old rail line. Of course, we need a farmhouse for the people who live here and run the farm, and this one has a nice little patio out front, although it might not be so nice with all these trucks driving by, but anyway, it's nicely decorated. So now that we've gotten some agriculture down, let's hop on over here to the area where we're going to transition from the urbanized part of Todos Santos to the agricultural part. I thought an interesting way to do that would be to have a farm of a kind, a solar farm. Maybe this used to be a farm field, but as the concrete jungle of Todos Santos has begun to encroach on this area, the land was bought up and turned into a solar farm. So taking these assets, turning them into POs just to size them up a little bit and make it easier to line them up in these nice straight lines, and then copying and pasting them all the way down here until they fill up this entire area. And then because there is a bit of a slope here in between the solar farm and the highway, I'm just deleting the ones that clip into the ground like that. Then we just need to go in and detail the surroundings, which ended up actually being a lot easier than I expected. Actually, this whole solar farm build ended up being a breeze compared to what I thought it would be. Now with that all detailed, we have this little mirror image space over here. I'm just going to fill it in with another generic farm. Moving back down the river toward the other farms, we have this little bend that's cut off by the rail, so it's going to get the foliage treatment, going by the same logic that I mentioned before. Hopefully it's not getting too confusing as to where we're oriented right now, but I think it's easier to work inwards, so going from the outside of the agricultural area to the inside, because that just allows you to figure out what sorts of shapes you want these fields to be. Anyway, we're currently in the approximate middle of the agricultural area that surrounds the river, and we're starting a new farmhouse. This one ends up being pretty fancy. I wanted to represent that it's a fairly wealthy family because they're going to end up growing sugarcane. Now, as I mentioned in the distillery episode, there's not that much sugarcane grown here anymore, but of course it used to be one of the major cash crops grown on the island. So I wanted to have at least one farm involved in that. I was able to find a lot of awesome field assets for this build. Networks, props, decals, all that stuff. Unfortunately, there's no sugarcane asset, not in field form, not in prop or tree form at all. So what I'm using is corn, because there are a whole lot of cornfield assets that look really good. And if you blur your eyes a little bit or just look at it from a distance, corn stalks kind of look like sugarcane a little bit. So that's what I'm going with. Doing a very similar style to the other farm fields, just copying and pasting the field buildings everywhere. Some of these are functional buildings, and some of them are just props. And then doing some of the same windbreaks and a little detailed entrance area as well. You might notice that it's hard to line these little square field prop assets up, and you get these kind of ugly overlapping lines that stand out pretty clearly. It's really hard to avoid that kind of thing when you're using props and decals to make these big fields. So I'd probably recommend going with the field networks for the most part if you wanted to do an agricultural build like this, and maybe use these a little bit more sparingly than I have. But I really did want to just give some volume to these fields because the field networks are very flat and they're really meant to represent either empty fields or very young plants in these fields. So it's kind of hard to find a balance between those two aspects. For the very last farm of the episode, I wanted to do something a little bit different. So we have a farm that's dedicated to agrotourism. I mostly did this because I thought it would be a good opportunity to include a few different assets that I hadn't already used. So we have this nice little barn. I imagine they would have chickens or something in there, I guess. Some greenhouses that look really nice. I did put a few of these in the old town on some of the roofs, but they were way shrunken down, just like a personal greenhouse. And this one is a bit more of a commercial scale, and that just seems like something you'd see at this sort of farm. There's also this lovely little restaurant asset. This would be like a farm-to-table kind of place where they would take all the stuff that they grow and cook it up for you there. So you wouldn't have to go on like a full farm tour to appreciate the fruits of this farm. You could just stop here for lunch, and maybe they would also have like a little, not quite a farmer's market, but they would also sell some of their crops here as well. I was getting kind of tired of just having plain areas of dirt and grass and stuff like that, so I tried to break up the opening to the lot here. We had this weird triangle kind of between the old railway and the road, so I just wanted to break that up a little bit and make it look, I suppose, more realistic. I'm mostly just trying to think of where vehicles would actually need to go to park or to pick up or drop off materials, that kind of stuff. So there's some little pull-ins here and there, and then everything where there wouldn't be a vehicle driving around occasionally, they've basically just let nature take its course, and so we have these little pockets of greenery. I think another one of the hallmarks of these sorts of rural roads, and I'm just assuming it's pretty much like this all over the world, is that when you have a business like this that's just run off the roadside, they're going to have an interesting sign out front. So in this case, they have a pretty normal gate, but then I'm going to take this restaurant banner, remove everything else using PO, just selecting all the nodes and merging them down. So we just have this sign tacked on the front of an old abandoned car, which I think kind of has its own charm, even though it's not like the fanciest sign you're ever going to see. As for all the stuff that's actually grown on this farm, I wanted to do a little bit of everything. So we're using some of these short field props. There's also another plantain orchard, I guess you'd call it. Plantain orchard? I don't know. Anyway, some rows of plantain trees with some more hedgerows around them. Of course, some more of these field networks because they're just so easy to work with and they're absolutely fantastic for filling in these larger areas and getting nice, clean, square fields. Just trying to alternate them so we have some different colors here and there. Some of these kind of bluish rows of plants, which I actually really like, and I thought that I hadn't used them enough yet, so I'm going to put them in here. And then to finish it off, there are these little plants, which instead of using a big network or building for, I have to draw them out in lines like this, which is really tedious and probably terrible for performance, but I thought they looked really cool. And I hadn't yet included anything that looked anything like coffee. And that's another thing that I really wanted to have included in this build, but there wasn't a dedicated asset on the workshop, and there wasn't really even an asset that looked like a coffee plant. It's kind of a weird looking plant, actually. But these were the closest I could find. They sort of look like a young coffee plant. So we have a bunch of those put down there. I tried making a little scene here where there was this field being actively watered. I was going to use these active fountain props, but it didn't really work out, didn't look that good, so I just scrapped the idea. So we're going to finish up this farm with just a couple of these hedgerows, and next up, we're going to build the town of Rio de Plata. we're going to add just a basic commercial strip along this stretch of highway here. For some reason, I've really been struggling in Todos Santos to get the right spacing on this sort of commercial development with lots of setback parking and parking lots in between many of the buildings. So I tried to go a little bit more in that direction here, especially now that we're more in, not even in the suburbs anymore, but in the city outskirts, in the rural areas. And this is just a small town kind of in the center of all of that. So I really wanted to go for that sort of look, although I do still have some wall-to-wall buildings here and there because I didn't want it to be like too overloaded with parking. At least by Todos Santos standards. Because this town is kind of in the middle of nowhere, but also in between the freeway and much of the stuff that's in this western part of Todos Santos, does end up getting a lot of through traffic, a lot of industrial traffic that's heading over to the distillery and brewery area, and then also people who are taking this as kind of a shortcut to some of the western portions of Todos Santos proper, which is honestly exactly what I wanted. So you could imagine that people would be driving through this town, and this commercial strip and the railroad station are basically all that they would see, and the rest of the town is just kind of nondescript. But I did want to detail out this commercial strip at least a little bit, with just a few touches here and there. That's something I've been kind of slacking on recently, detailing these sorts of commercial strips, so I wanted to get into that at least a little bit. And then the rest of the town is going to be pretty similar to a lot of the low-density neighborhoods that we've already built. So even though it's just a kind of nondescript town, they do have a couple things. They have a school over here with a couple of fields that looks pretty nice. I wanted to detail it up, give it a little attention there. And I also made a small supermarket, which seems kind of like an oxymoron, but whatever. But I just did that off camera. It was kind of boring, but maybe you'll catch a glimpse of that in the cinematics. But I just thought that I would mention that here, just in case you were interested. But other than that, though, it's just your typical small town. It's not too aggressive in terms of how much development they're adding on to the outside of what's already there. In Todos Santos, we had lots of different subdivisions that were being added and places that were being cleared for new neighborhoods, and you don't really have much of that here. You have a couple of blocks sticking out additionally over here, and they have, a couple of roads that they could theoretically extend out and add some more houses, but there's just not that much new development going on here, at least in recent times. Now, the fact that this is such a small town with so little going on, relatively speaking, it might make you wonder why there's a stop on the city's main metro line here. And the answer is that I just wanted to have a rail line that ran out here because I thought it would look cool. But I did come up with a small lore reason, which is that this town lobbied for it to try to encourage growth because they weren't seeing much growth. And it was a pretty controversial project because there's basically this station and then the next one over is like way, way farther over to the east, in the actual main part of Todos Santos, so it would have access to a lot of residents. But somehow this project got pushed through, and now we have a metro station at the smallest town in the region. So for the final part of this project, I wanted to go back in time, at least a little bit. Moving away from the agricultural side of things, this section of Todos Santos really hasn't been developed too much, but there used to be an airstrip here. And this is inspired by the Dorado Airport, which I'll link some information about in the description. It's kind of interesting. It's an abandoned airport. There's really not much of it left now, but there is a small piece of the airstrip remaining that's used as a park in this development here. But anyway, I wanted to build something that's inspired by that and that is in a bit better shape in that it sort of still exists. Obviously, it's massively deteriorated. There are plenty of weeds growing in the cracks. Some of it has been demolished here to make way for this irrigation channel, and it's just generally worse for wear. I wasn't sure if it was realistic to have them like break down just a part of this runway to make way for the channel, but a while after I did this build, I was going around on Google Maps, and I happened to stumble across this airstrip in Tijuana, which has kind of a similar feature, except there's a highway here instead of an irrigation ditch. I just thought it was funny that I happened to stumble across this pretty much exact same phenomenon somewhere else. Anyway, to make the runway, I figured out about how long I wanted it to be in units, and then drew that out with the road, and turned a concrete prop into a procedural object, and stretched it out to be the proper size. The texture actually stretches pretty well, so I'm just going to keep that how it is. And then basically just made it into this giant rectangle. It does look a little plain, just without any details though, so I come in and add some panel decals, wear decals, and of course some weeds growing up here and there, and a big coating of grass around the edge. I assume that all the grasses would really love all that disturbed land where the runway was laid out, so there's a bunch growing up there. Now the reason we have these turnarounds at the end is because there's only one entrance to the runway. So if you were in a plane and you wanted to take off, you'd have to leave the terminal, which we're adding right here, and go all the way down the runway, turn around at the little turnaround thing, and then proceed to take off. Despite all the wear and tear that I tried to put into this, I still felt like it looked a little bit too new. So I thought I'd switch up the texture a little bit, and the story I came up with for that is that these turnarounds were added later on when this became a higher capacity airstrip than it originally was. So they have a more recent looking texture, but maybe they were made out of something that wears down a little bit more easily. So they've been a little bit more busted up than the main part of the runway, which is made out of these road assets by Ronix, which I just use Node Controller to stretch them out. They still look pretty nice like that, and I just have a few of them stacked here and to run all the way along the course of the runway. Luckily, I had it all lined up already, so I didn't have to worry about fiddling around and getting it at the right angle. Now, this is the first time I ever messed around with the graphic effects settings in IMT. So for the center lines, first I measured them out to the approximate correct length for a runway, and then adjusted the texture settings until they looked nice and worn down. And it's just nice to not have to do that manually with decals or PO or what have you. Anyway, going back to the story of the airport, I'm imagining that the apron, right next to the terminal, would have originally been the same type of surface as the middle of the runway, but when they went to add on the turnarounds at the end, they also resurfaced the apron for whatever reason. So now that has the same texture as the turnarounds, although there are a few places where it's been more worn down for various reasons. So I'm just adding a whole bunch of these damaged decals, trying to arrange them in a way that they don't really stand out as individual decals, so you can kind of see different patterns of wear and tear along the edge, along the edge of these kind of weird triangles here. And then, of course, any plain areas that are left, just a few of these generic stain decals that just kind of spruce it up, just that little extra bit. I found it very difficult to figure out how to decorate the area around the airstrip, because I wasn't sure exactly how old it was. I probably should have thought of that before I actually did this build, but too late for that now. So what I came up with is that there probably wouldn't have been enough time for like a whole dense woods to grow up around it. So there might have been a little bit small cluster of trees like next to the terminal itself, because they wouldn't really need to get rid of that, and that's just gotten denser as time has gone by. But then for the runway itself, it would have been totally flat and clear when it was in use, of course. So that's had a lot less time for, you know, basically a forest to take root literally. So I decided to just go for some taller grass, and it doesn't look very tall from above, obviously, because you're looking down at it. But when you're down there, it kind of does look a little bit overgrown, but not too tall. I think you'll see what I mean in the cinematics. I did plant a couple of rows of trees, thinking that maybe they planted these when the airport was decommissioned, just wanting to, block it from the view from the road. Still not too sure about that. I think it looks kind of nice, though, even if it's not super realistic. Now we're going to go back down to this main entrance to the terminal, which of course is blocked off because this place will probably be fairly dangerous. But we are also in the middle of nowhere, so it's not like there's tons of security to keep people out. If you wanted to go in there, you pretty much could. After finishing the airstrip, there were still a few weirdly shaped plots of land that I hadn't filled in yet, so I just wanted to get those filled in with some plain foliage, woods, grass, the usual. And we're just going to do a before and after type sequence and zoom through those really quickly. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Todos Santos. I really hope you enjoyed your time in the city today, and I can't wait to see you on the next one. By the way, this is my view right now. It's really cold, so we're going to have an extra long round of cinematics this time. That way I can at least pretend that I'm warm.